Do you guys have any questions about last week?
What was the last one?
Calories.
Oh,
Talked all about calories and just the idea that like working out more and eating less, what it really truly does, even though it's like been the standard advice forever and every doctor says that's what you have to do. And then you ask like one or two follow-up questions, you end up at the same place. Like they don't even know, or they might be struggling with their own weight or health themselves. It's tough. Our bodies don't have calorie sensors. It doesn't think about calories in that way. So
we don't have a calorie tracker in our body.
right.
It just knows if it's full or
Exactly.
hungry or wants junk.
That's a great point. And then like the calorie trackers that we can even use on our phones. You switch back to a flip phone, you won't have to worry about it anyway. It's tough. How do you know? You don't. Who did the measurement? What was the size of the apple? What kind of apple? How is it grown? There's so many different things that we can get some good guesses and estimates. But I thought one of the biggest things that just blew my mind to relearn was like the 20 calories a day. If it were all about calories and you were over by 20 calories a day, in 10 years, you'd be gaining 20 pounds. Like there's no way our body's tolerances are that fine that it couldn't sort that out. So thought that part was interesting. Just as humans, the foods that we eat impact how we burn them. So like if you have a toaster, you put bread in the toast, and every time you just get a piece of toast, it's as if like with the human body, if you put in different types of bread, it would actually change the toaster itself. And that's kind of more along the lines of how our bodies work versus how a simple machine where you just put an input and you get the same output in every time. So I talked to a woman this last week who was a contestant on The Biggest Loser. And she went to the contest and lost a whole bunch of weight and immediately gained it all back and then some when she was done. And so, anyway, if it was all about calories, we'd be in a much better spot. So today, this is one of my favorites. This is going to be all about the three major macronutrients. So macro meaning large, nutrient, obviously things that we can eat. Micronutrients would be things like minerals and vitamins. We need them in very small quantities. Macros, people talk about like tracking your macros. That's what they're talking about, is how much protein are you consuming, and how much energy are you consuming, either coming from carbohydrates or fat. As always, do just want to say that we're trying to be as diet agnostic as possible. Like I'm not trying to push people into a certain diet. It's just to understand things and then make decisions about what effects you are seeking from certain foods. And that's all this is. So basically, we're going to go through all of the different macronutrients. We're going to talk about what they do, what they don't do, where you can find them, maybe how much of them you need, and maybe some like unrealistic expectations we have about certain macronutrients. Again, I think we get confused about this, and nutrition coaches will give people different targets and things to try to hit different numbers. And again, if we can think critically about these things, we can make decisions about what foods we're going to include in our diets and what we should expect from including them. So the two documents we have today is the normal kind of guide to the episodes. This would be our outline of everything. Feel free to take notes. I left plenty of room as we're going through some of this stuff. All the references are in the back. If you really, really, really want to deep dive into some of this stuff, I made 3 different 4-hour long podcast episodes that were all about each one of the macronutrients. It was basically like the highlights of everything that we've done on our show. One was about protein, one was about carbohydrate, one was about fat. Those are really comprehensive deep dives if you want to learn more about this stuff. So the links are there. I also have this document, which I've used in the past, and it's called How to Build a Meal. And this just has the different kind of components, and again, the kinds of macronutrients on the front. So how to build a meal, how are you going to choose to kind of include these things, again, in your diet. On the back side, I find this to be like a little bit helpful. They have examples of some of these things. So you know, like, okay, well, we're talking about protein. Well, what is a source of protein? Well, there's a bunch of different proteins that you can eat. This is, for me, just like not the perfect document, and it doesn't mean to like go out to the store and buy all these things. You won't know what to do with all of these foods anyway. It's just to give examples and provide a framework for what we're going to be talking about. There's a space on the bottom where it says like foods I like, so you can go through and say like, okay, I like some of these foods and put them in the bottom. You can do that if you like. You don't have to. It's just, again, to provide us with a framework, and we're just going to follow along on that. Also, this will give you a serving size as an example for each one of the different foods, and the serving size is based on your hand. So you'll see that on the other document as well. I put that in, the kind of like, yeah, this part of the document that says your hand is your portioning tool. Serving a protein is about a palm of your hand. A serving of vegetables is a fist size. A serving of carbohydrate would be 1 cup hand, and a serving of fat would be about a tablespoon, or the size of your thumb. It is one way to think about things. Again, I find it helpful as like a framework. If you have no idea what servings of things are, that at least provides some context. And I also do like the fact that nowhere on any of these documents does it say anything about calories or exact quantities. It's just like a general idea of things that you can be eating. So yeah, just wanted to explain that. So protein. Now on this other document, it says choose your lean protein. We'll talk about why we may or may not want lean proteins in our diet to begin with, but it does talk about protein. Do you guys have any ideas? When you hear protein, what do you think of?
Well, now I think steak,
Okay.
but then I could think cheese or dairy.
Okay. Yeah. You say now you think steak. What would have been in the past?
Well, the cheese.
Yep.
Or milk.
Yep. Yep. I think it's really interesting. Do you find yourself craving red meat now?
Not as much.
Okay.
But sometimes I will, if I need something protein, it'll be just a slice of meat, like ham or turkey,
Yep.
and then I'll do a piece of cheese.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, those are really good sources of
We already
protein.
have milk in
Yeah.
the house anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and you do okay when you eat cheese? Usually fine? Cool. That's great. So when we're talking about some of these macronutrients, we've referenced this earlier. We're talking about energy sources, and we're also talking about building blocks. And protein is best to be thought of as a building block. Protein is not a great energy source in itself. In an emergency situation, your body can dismantle some of the protein that you have, and it can use it for energy. It's just very inefficient, especially if you have other fuel to burn. So like if you were running a furnace and you had a bunch of firewood chopped and prepared, it would be really inefficient and not that smart to like chop up your couch and throw that into the fire. Like you already have the firewood already as a fuel. You don't need to break down something that can be useful for something else. So that's what protein is. So think of it as building blocks and not necessarily a very good energy source. You don't store a ton of protein, save for in your like lean muscle tissue. So protein is what we call an essential nutrient, which means if you do not consume protein, that will be fatal. You will die. It is essential in the diet. Non-essential means that you don't need it. You won't die if you don't have it. Protein is essential. Another way to think about this is the individual components of protein are basically like Lego blocks, if you want to think of it that way. They're called amino acids, and it's basically what, like if you had a Lego boat, it would be made up of Lego bricks, and those are the individual, we call them again, amino acids that make different components. And so like your body can decide how it uses those building blocks and in what ways. So if you give your body a Lego boat, for example, your body's going to disassemble that, and maybe it will assemble it into a Lego car or whatever it feels like it needs. So that's what protein is. It's one of the most important macronutrients, again, because not only is it essential, but you need it for repair processes. Obviously, one of the biggest things that protein does is it builds up your lean tissue. Lean tissue includes muscle, but is not limited to muscle. So a lot of people don't realize the structure of your bones, your hormones. There's a lot of things that protein is used to construct that is not just muscle mass. As we age, we become more and more anabolic resistant. Anabolic is the word for building up. So over time, you become more and more resistant to building yourself up. As most of us know, in our 20s, we can build lots of muscle. It's really easy. As we age, it gets harder and harder and harder. And now we have populations of people that are aging and they have a fall or have some type of injury that they never seem to really recover from. And that's because they do something when they're sedentary. When they're sedentary, they lose all their muscle mass. And then it becomes really, really difficult to protect yourself from falls, to protect yourself from bone issues and problems. That's why strength training is so important. But a big component of that is making sure you're getting an adequate amount of protein in your diet. Sources of protein. If we go back to that other document, you are going to see a list of animal products. So chicken, turkey, fish, seafood, lean pork, eggs, lean beef, wild game, cottage cheese, whey protein. You're also going to see plant-based lean proteins. So that's tofu, tempeh, I don't know. Plant-based protein powder, beans, and legumes. We get protein from all kinds of different sources. You can get them from animal products. You can get them from plant-based products. It is really, really, really critical to say that animal protein sources are much more available to humans, and they don't come with what we call anti-nutrients or things that can even do things like block the absorption of protein. Where plant products do have that, there is some research that says that plant protein can compare to animal protein as far as quality and muscle mass, but the study that was done where they took two groups and they put one group of people on mostly animal-based products and then made up a certain difference with a whey protein shake, where the second group was eating a vegan diet and they were supplementing them with soy protein shakes to make up the amount of protein to make sure they were equal on protein. These were young men who were strength training, and they showed very similar results in both groups. And they used that to say that like the plant protein is just as good as animal protein. That's a bit of a stretch. If you want to gain muscle, it's pretty easy to gain muscle if you're lifting weights as a 20-year-old. So I would beg anybody on a plant-based diet to get whatever protein that they could get, because it's still very, very critical. But if you are more omnivore, I would try to get your protein from animal sources as much as possible. One of the amino acids that we talk about frequently that's really, really important for this stuff is called leucine. Leucine is an amino acid, L-E-U-C. Lucy, that's a good way to remember it. Leucine. Leucine triggers what we call muscle protein synthesis, or the building of muscle. You need about 3 grams of leucine to trigger MPS, or muscle protein synthesis. And you can normally get 3 grams of leucine in about 30 to 40 grams of animal protein, depending on which kind. It's a really good idea to try to get that in one serving. In that sense, it's a little bit better to eat a full meal with real food, like the steak you mentioned, or chicken, or any of those other sources, and maybe have, like where this recommends for women, on the sheet it says a normal serving of lean protein is 1 palm. I think that is way too low for men or for women. I think at least 2 palm-sized portions would be much closer to what you'd be shooting for. And it's better to get that again with real food at one time versus like I had a protein shake that had 20 grams and then I waited 2 hours and I had a protein bar. It's basically a candy bar that had 10 grams of protein in it, and that was 3 hours later. And then I had 3 pieces of ham. 3 hours later, I had the piece of cheese. Like it's easier to get it all in one so that you know you're getting enough leucine, again, to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Timing of protein seems to matter less now than we thought it did. We thought that you had to get protein after workouts, for example. That seems to be less true than we thought. The bigger thing is to get the overall amount of protein that you need. Protein targets. I like to recommend most people in most situations get about 1 gram per pound of what they would consider their optimal body weight every single day. Meaning, if you're 400 pounds, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be eating 400 grams of protein. A 400-pound person might think they want to get their weight down to like 200, and that might be a nice target of how much protein they should be eating in a day. The standard recommendations on protein is like, I've seen as low as like 55 to 60 grams of protein in a day. That is embarrassingly low. That is, our recommendations are way, way, way too low. And again, I think it's a big reason why we're seeing people not aging as well and then suffering a lot of injuries and bone problems and all kinds of stuff that we're seeing with people now that we didn't used to in the past. So again, I like to think of it as, think of what your ideal weight is, try to target that as the number of grams of protein you're going to get in a day. There are caveats to that. Like I said, fasting would be a big one. If you are doing any kind of time restricted eating, you're fasting for a portion of the day, your body will be recycling proteins, and you probably don't need as much as if you were eating, what normal people would do and not time restrict their eating. So that's good news for a lot of people. Intermittent fasting is a great tool that a lot of people can be using. You don't need as much protein in that context because your body will be recycling the protein that it has and reusing it. Again, that's called autophagy. Yeah, really awesome to see. Again, different sources of protein here. Again, you can put the ones you like, don't like, whatever, but protein is very, very important, and that's why I wanted to start with that. Any questions on protein? If you must supplement, I think whey protein for a lot of people is a really good way to go. Just want to make sure you're tolerating it well. There's also different kinds of the way they extract protein, so you can get an isolate or a concentrate, and we can get more into that in another discussion. But yeah, I would, if you want to supplement, I would just think of them as that, just supplements. Okay, excellent. Next, we're going to be moving on to the family of foods that are carbohydrates. And this is broken up into two separate things. All of these are carbohydrates, but the way this is broken up is fruits and vegetables have been kept separate from other carbohydrates like starches. It's going to be a little too windy, but I will try.
So that kind of means that starches is not gravy, it's grains and other things.
Yes, yes.
I didn't know that till that moment.
It's nice to kind of think about our carbohydrates kind of in three ways. And again, we'll talk about fruits and vegetables and other sources of carbohydrates. But really, like when you're thinking about carbohydrates, it really, this is very much oversimplified, but a nice way to think about it, where you can get sugar, you can get starch, and you can get fiber. So sugar is already broken down into the form of sugar that your body uses, which is called glucose. When you're consuming glucose, fructose, table sugar, that kind of thing, you're getting a lot, that sugar has a lot of glucose in it. And the glucose is what your body uses as a fuel source. Sugar gets into the blood, into the digestive tract and into the bloodstream very, very quickly. The cool thing about a starch is much more complex. Like if you've ever heard of a complex carbohydrate, literally a starch, like a plant will take different strings of sugars and kind of bind them all together for different purposes to make a starch, where your body literally has to go through a longer process to break that down. So where sugar gets into the blood very, very quickly, starch gets into the blood more slowly. Still is sugar in the blood, but it does so at a really like slow rate. So the way I'll compare this is like, think about your bloodstream as a freeway. It's where everything kind of traffics around and moves around. So if it's rush hour, 5 p.m., and lots of cars are getting onto the freeway and there's no meter, they're all just rushing in really, really quick, you have traffic problems. A lot of accidents can happen, cars running into each other. There's way too many cars and they're way like in the same spaces all at once. So that's kind of the way sugar reacts. It just gets into the blood very, very quickly. A starch, it's now like putting that meter onto your freeway on-ramp. It's still more cars on the road. It's definitely still rush hour, but when they're going out more gradually, the flow of traffic is much better and easier to deal with. So that's the way we kind of think about the differences there. Fiber is not really used by the body at all. It's something that we eat and it really just passes straight through. There's different types of fiber. Fiber can also make some of the other carbohydrates more difficult to digest. And so by adding a lot of fiber, you can basically create a lot of bulk in your diet that doesn't have very many calories and is like basically something that you don't even absorb to begin with. A lot of people say fiber is really good for your gut and your microbiome, and we're really early in kind of understanding all of that stuff. So we'll see how that kind of research pans out. But those are the three, I guess, kind of like basic summaries of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates in general are what we call non-essential. So carbohydrates are not necessary for life. They can have certain benefits for sure, and we can eat them as humans. It's fine, but we don't need them. Like if you were living as an Inuit, you essentially almost never had carbohydrates, and they live really long and healthy lives. That's kind of the way we want to think about carbohydrates. Now, it gets confusing because carbohydrates are necessary inside the body. You need a constant flow of carbohydrates always. Your brain is going to need some, red blood cells need some, part of your kidneys always needs a bit of carbohydrate. But it's so necessary that your body can just regulate that all the time and try to keep your blood sugar at a very, very kind of constant state depending on what's going on. In a healthy person, you will only have about 1 teaspoon of sugar in the entire 5 liters of blood that is circulating around. So if you think about that, that's why your blood doesn't taste sweet. It tastes more salty. You have way more salt in your blood than you have sugar. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny minuscule amount. Let's talk about fruits and vegetables. So again, this is kind of splitting up all different types of carbohydrates, but just remember, these are still carbohydrates. Fruits and vegetables are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates come from plant foods. Plants make them. It's really interesting to me that we all say this, fruits and vegetables, vegetables and fruits. We say them like they're kind of the same thing because we find them in the produce section, but they're not really the same thing at all. So the fruit is really easy to distinguish because it's the brighter colors, normally has the really good taste. They're available seasonally in most places in the world, where vegetables are all the other parts of the plant. So it could be the roots or the stalks or the leaves. It's everything else that kind of comes along with different plants. Different issues with both things. And the first thing I want to say about all carbohydrates and plant foods in general, all plants have toxins. That's called botany. That's just a fact. That doesn't mean that all plants are toxic to everything, but every plant makes toxins. And if you look around, even here at this park, there's so many different varieties of plants that are growing. Different trees, different shrubs, different flowers, the grasses, like there's so much diversity of all these different plants. And despite that, we can't eat any of them. There's nothing edible, even though there's so many different kind of plants around here. There's nothing that we could eat and subsist on. Some animals develop different things that they can do for different plants. We know like panda bears, right? Eucalyptus, because they've evolved with that plant and they can detoxify the toxins in that plant. So just to say that all plants have toxins, although it's true, it doesn't mean that it's going to be always toxic to you when you consume them. And the least toxic, generally speaking, the least toxic kind of plant foods that we have are going to be fruits. Fruits are created by plants to entice animals to eat them, which then works with the biology of the tree and helps the tree do exactly what the tree wants to do, which is reproduce and replicate. And so if there is something basically like a little sweeter that has seeds in it, the plant is going to cooperate with birds or rodents or primates or humans, whatever, because we're going to eat that thing and then we're going to go somewhere else and we might poop out some seeds that now are going to be another tree. And that's how the tree spreads and does, again, what every tree wants to do. Found this to be very, very interesting. One of the interesting thing about fruits is most of us don't exactly know what true fruit actually looks like because we're used to grocery store fruit. So for example, even just yesterday, I posted a picture on my social media of 4 strawberries that came off of my strawberry plant. And they quite easily, all 4 of these fit in the palm of my hand with separation between them. They're tiny, tiny, tiny things. It's a mature plant. I've had it for 10 years. There's like a week where you get strawberries and they're small. One day I picked one. I just left it out on the countertop where I leave any fruit that I always buy, and any other fruit stays good. Our house is cool, as you know. This strawberry, like one day later, was completely bad. It had already like really decomposed. And so we don't realize that strawberries are not these like palm-sized things that we see at the store. They're much smaller. They're much more bitter. And again, this is a book from some of my former podcast guests, Craig and Maria Emmerich, and just wanted to show you like some of like the way we look at our fruits these days. Like here's the heartbreaker with watermelon. What a real watermelon looks like. I'll even just read this. Based on 17th century paintings, wild watermelon may once have had seeds arranged in a swirly geometric pattern. It was less than 2 inches across and had to be opened with a hammer or sharp object. Had an extremely bitter taste. 6 known varieties found only in Namibia and Botswana.
It looks like an orange or grapefruit.
Right. It's totally, yeah. It's way smaller. Again, really bitter, very starchy. Where a modern watermelon measures 26 inches across, over 10 times bigger, very sweet and juicy, easy to open. More than 1,200, varieties are grown year-round in 15 plus countries, producing 95 million tons of fruit. Wow. This is called hybridization and crossbreeding. So we love sugar, we love carbohydrates, we just can't ever find them. So we have to change our poor watermelon, I know it's your favorite food, to be able to maximize. What's that? Ice cream. Mixed with watermelon. We have to change our foods to breed for that. So watermelon is an example. Here is
taking your strawberry. Well, we've trained our food that it's full of preservatives, probably even the fresh food.
Right. We talked about apples 2 weeks ago, and apples are over a year old by the time they're even in a grocery store. Of course, it's not going to go bad overnight if it's covered in a wax or it was sprayed with a chemical or held in a silo where it was pumped with whatever it's pumped with. So here's some more examples. Wild banana. The first bananas were cultivated over 7,000 years ago in Papua New Guinea. There was a few varieties. Most of the flesh was inedible. Modern bananas are grown all over the world. 80 million tons of bananas produced every year. The original plants would sometimes produce mutant variants without seeds. Bananas are now seedless, 3 times longer, and over 21% sugar. Look at the difference. A banana in nature versus like the Cavendish banana that we all think is a banana is completely different from the original version. Carrots. The wild carrot was very thin with a distinct and powerful flavor. It was originally purple or white and originated in Persia. Modern carrot is a result of years of manipulating multiple strains of purple carrots through experimentation done by the Dutch in the 16th century. The bright orange variety we see today is much sweeter and grown year-round all over the world. Most edible kind of roots are kind of like that. They're very bitter and they're tiny. If you hike in the mountains, you can kind of get the ones that taste like onions if you know which plant you're looking for. Corn and peach are also kind of featured there, where corn was a grass. Totally different to what corn is like today. Peaches, you see, just completely different in size. The last one they have here, strawberries and tomatoes. The difference between what strawberries used to be, how we hybridize them and crossbreed them to get big, juicy, delicious strawberries, quite different to what they used to be.
They like the strawberries you had.
They were really good. The strawberries I had were really good, but they're tiny, tiny, tiny. Tiny, tiny, tiny. The other thing that we've lost when it comes to all plant foods, but in particular fruits, and if you want to say quote unquote like vegetables, is seasonality. There was seasonality in our fruits in particular. We don't have that anymore. You can go anywhere around the world. You can go to Toronto in April and go to Whole Foods and buy mangoes. You can go to Europe and buy pineapples. You can do that in the winter or the summer. It's just a very, very different context how we have foods now versus how we've had them in the past. When you got fruits, you got vastly smaller amount of it. You were competing with all the other animals like we talked about, like birds. If you've ever had fruit trees, you know how destructive they can be. They get at it way easier than we can as humans. And you just get them for such a short amount of time that it's just not a question of whether it's available. Like if you saved apples in a barrel, like maybe a month, 2 months, if it was cold, maybe they'd keep a little bit longer. Same with like potatoes and things like that. But eventually you'd run into a problem where just the seasonality of the thing, you're just not going to get those things anymore. This was made the most apparent to me last year when I would walk around my neighborhood and people start gardens around here, but oftentimes it's so much work that people like abandon them or they move. And so these gardens just really just go to waste. And so if I see that like tomatoes have fallen off of a tomato plant, I'll go and eat some. They're super good. As you well know, Utah tomatoes are amazing. They're delicious. Store tomatoes are terrible in comparison.
Especially in the winter.
Oh, they're awful. Tasteless and really fibery and like kind of just not even the same thing. So
in a restaurant, they're even worse. And
Yep.
then I'd rather not have the tomato at all in the winter.
So that's the thing. Like again, it's like getting to be fall last year. I'm eating a few tomatoes. I saved a few, put them into like cottage cheese with salt and pepper and olive oil, and ate. Oh, they're so good. And then the next day, it's a hard freeze, and all the tomatoes are gone. And it's like, okay, I can either go buy tomatoes at the store, which taste terrible, or this like yummy, delicious treat that I'd had is now unavailable to me. I want them. I crave them. It's no longer an option for me. So it's a super bummer, but that's kind of things that we need to just remember as far as fruits go, is that the biggest problems that people have with them now can be the sugar content is really, really high. The nutrients you get is very, very low. We can eat them year round. Those are things that can be problematic. I'll never tell anybody that like apples made people obese or oranges are terrible for you.
But
I think
we're told that they're nutritious for us, so we need to eat them.
yeah, exactly. The soil is a lot different than it used to be, so the plants are not getting as many nutrients into these things as they used to. We're told they're nutritious. I don't think they're as nutritious as we think, and there's other downsides. There's always compromises with plant foods. Same with vegetables. Vegetables, this is so weird to think about, but most vegetables that you would recognize in the store were not a thing 150 years ago. Like we now have, I want to say it's like 10 different very common vegetables that all come from one plant, the mustard plant. Cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. I should remember the rest. There's several different like parts of this plant that we've individually bred to get these certain vegetables that did not ever exist. As recently as like the 1860s, they were telling people like you shouldn't be eating vegetables because this is how you get candida. It wasn't even considered like worth like the amount of work that you would have to do to get the vegetables. Again, they would also be very, very seasonal. If you've ever had a garden, you know how much work goes into it. Like we said earlier, it can be tough. The other thing you want to think of as far as vegetables are now you're talking about the part of a plant that it is going to try to protect a little bit more. When you eat fruit, you benefit the plant. So it's willing to make compromises and detoxify fruit for you so that you can help the plant. That is not the same with vegetables. with the stalks and the roots and the leaves. Those are the critical parts of the plant that need defending. They don't just defend against humans, us, it's insects and rodents and birds. And there's reason why all of these trees are growing and they're fine, they're not getting eaten, because they've developed certain chemical toxins to make sure that their predators don't consume them and thrive when they eat them. It's just a fact of life. Some plants have more, some plants have less. There's very few vegetables that I will tell somebody not to eat. Outside of, I would tell everybody, do not eat spinach. That's the one vegetable I will just universally tell people, it is not worth it. There's other leafy greens that you can eat, but spinach in particular is very high in a plant compound called oxalate. And oxalates are crystals, whether they are the mechanical crystals. So if you imagine in your head taking spinach raw and eating it, you get a certain mouthfeel that's kind of like a grit. Those are the crystals, the mechanical crystals. It's like chewing glass or sandpaper that the plant used to help as a pesticide. And now that's going through your body and it can do damage. But more than that, oxalate is also kind of an acid that combined with minerals inside the body like calcium. So kidney stones they come from oxalates. Eye problems, belching, burping can happen 4 to 6 hours after consuming something high in oxalates. Your body has no way to detoxify them and use them. It just has to get rid of them. So I've worked with people, horror stories of them consuming too many oxalates, things like tons of almonds, tons of spinach, beet greens, quote unquote healthy foods we think are healthy, that just you can accumulate this toxin and they can cause a lot of damage, and people have to be very careful about how they step away from them. Cause a lot of damage. So that's not to say that you can't have them. And we had knowledge around certain vegetables. Like I asked my grandparents, like, did you guys always eat spinach when you were growing up? And it actually surprised me. They were like, yes, we did. I was like, oh, I didn't think even spinach was around that long ago. Quite old. You're very old. But they would say that, yes, we ate it. We always cooked it, which can help. And they would always serve it with a cream sauce that has calcium. There's all this ancient wisdom that we used to have around these things. Cooking is what makes us human. You can take plant foods and cook them and prepare them in a proper way, and you can help detoxify at least to some extent. So we end up having this really entitled view of plant foods where we just think we can just eat them as many as we want, however we want, without realizing that they have lives as well, and we need to just be thoughtful about how we're consuming them and eating them. So when I'm making recommendations around vegetables and fruit, I will just say, if you like them, go ahead and eat them. I call them free. They do have fiber. Some people consider that a benefit. They're also very low calorie. So it's not like you're going to consume an excessive amount of energy when you consume fruits and vegetables. Just with those caveats, just there's some that you should prepare in a certain way. There's some that also have a high amount of sugar. That can be problematic. Just be mindful of those things. If you enjoy them, that's fine. I also do challenge people sometimes when they tell me they love vegetables. And I'll say, like, okay, do you really love broccoli? Or do you really love broccoli that's cooked in butter and salted and served with some kind of a sauce? Do you really like salad? Am I going to catch you just chomping on a salad mix you get from the store? Or are you going to take that salad mix, combine it with olive oil and nuts and cheese and a bunch of delicious things? Like, I think what the body is really craving is like more of the proteins and fats, and the vegetables become this like kind of like a vehicle to get those things in the body. Like, I don't see many people chomping down Brussels sprouts. They'll certainly cook it with bacon and bacon grease, and it's delicious, really good. So anyway, tell people to keep that in mind as far as that goes. As we're finishing out the conversation about all carbohydrates, now we can open it up not only to just the fruits and vegetables, but the next picture down is like breads, pastas. You do see some honey. You do see some of the bananas and figs and all that stuff. Carbohydrates are all of those things. Again, they come from plants. We can refine carbohydrates so that we can break them down into sugar. We can take whole grains and just extract the flour out of it. Carbohydrates are one of our fuel sources. As we mentioned earlier, we've got two that we can consume that we use for energy. Carbohydrates are used as fuel for stress, if you want to think of it this way. You have an extremely limited amount of carbohydrate that you can store. So this will change. Everybody's a little bit different, but to just kind of summarize, most women, based on their muscle mass, because that's one of the places that you store carbohydrates is in your muscle, most women can only store about 1,500 calories of carbohydrates in their body. Between what's in the liver, what's in the muscles is the biggest, what we call carbohydrate sink, where carbohydrates can be stored, and also that tiny amount we mentioned, a teaspoon in the blood that's just kind of circulating along. In men, since their muscle mass might be a little higher, that number might be closer to 2,000 calories. But that is it. When your body is full to that capacity and you exceed that capacity, that's too many carbohydrates. Your body must convert them into fat so they can go into storage. Now, your body's capacity to store fat, unfortunately, for most of us who want to lose fat, is like seemingly endless, right? You see the shows of like these people that get up to 600 pounds and 700 pounds and 800 pounds. And it's just, that is literally hundreds and thousands of calories of energy that the body can store from fat. It can just store more and more and more and more. Not the case with carbohydrates. One thing that we need to keep in mind when it comes to carbohydrates, or the most important takeaway from this, I'm going to change this. I'm going to make this. People get this confused. I get questions on this all the time. We have blood sugar and we have a hormone very important to this discussion called insulin. Insulin is made by the pancreas, and its job is to get sugar out of the blood. So if we go back to our freeway analogy, when we have too many cars on the road, it's a really, really big problem. There's going to be accidents and all kinds of problems. So insulin would be the signal that says that the cars that are on the road need to go to their parking spaces. Insulin is primarily a storage hormone that says, okay, we got energy, let's store it. Let's put it away, store it where it needs to go. So again, too many cars, insulin is a signal that says, okay, cars, get off the freeway and go find parking spaces. Parking spaces for carbohydrates, again, are very, very limited. We don't have many of them. So it's really easy to fill up that storage capacity. So when we exceed that, what happens is your body will make, if you want to think of it as like new parking structures, and that's made of fat. Of all the macronutrients, carbohydrates have the greatest impact on the hormone insulin. So we see a big rise in blood sugar when we consume carbohydrates. The big drop is due to our bodies releasing so much insulin to deal with what is a temporary emergency in how we are bringing in fuel. We have to use kind of like a backup energy system because we've got so much sugar in the blood and it can't stay in the blood. It's really, really detrimental, so we need to store it. When you consume protein, you do get a slight rise in insulin, but it's very, very low. So if carbohydrate was like a 10, protein might be like a 3 or a 4. Fat is like a 0 or a 1. So when you consume fat, it's only when you consume like really weird high amounts of fat that nobody would ever consume and basically consume it on its own, that you basically get like no rise in insulin when you consume fat. You might get a small one, but it's not really that important. what we want to remember, it's the carbohydrates that have the greatest insulin response. So when we're thinking about carbohydrates, the problem is not carbohydrates themselves. If you had carbohydrates the way we had evolved with, when we're talking about like the fruits and the vegetables, you had them seasonally. You gain fat when you get them because insulin, that's what makes the fat. That's a good thing because you would be going into winter where I'm sad, Casey, because I can't find my delicious tomatoes anymore. They're not available to me, but now I can use the fat as a fuel source. Carbohydrates are just so exceedingly rare in nature, even in places where lots of fruit grows. It doesn't grow year round. It's just not around all the time. And with the way we started agriculture about 12,000 years ago to the way we started to industrialize our food system, now we've made sugar so inexpensive, so available everywhere. It's a problem of frequency. And so what happens is, over the years, you do such a bad job. I'm sorry, my pen's kind of dying. But basically what happens is the levels of blood sugar in our body are maintained over a long period of time. So this could be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, where your body can keep your blood sugar at a stable level. So you might be here with your blood sugar totally normal, and your doctor's saying like, great, you've got good blood sugar, you don't have diabetes. That's the way we diagnose diabetes, type 2, is because your blood sugar is so stable. But what we don't realize when we're consuming a lot of carbohydrates is insulin has already been rising for years to keep the blood sugar in check. That's what's doing it. And we don't measure very often insulin in people, we measure blood sugar. And so we'll look at this person and say, wow, you're totally healthy, there's no problem. But we don't realize that person is very close to their maximum kind of insulin output. And we even see over time that they're able to produce and make less and less and less. They're wearing out a system that was never designed to be run all day, every day, 365 days out of the year for decades. And that's what we have today. So it's not the carbohydrates, it's just more of an availability kind of a thing. If we looked at insulin and saw that somebody's fasting insulin was super high, we could make the diagnosis here and help somebody to reduce their carbohydrate intake to then get their insulin to go back to a much more normal level. Carbohydrates.
So if we imagine back that curve you just had for the carbohydrates way up high, and I was thinking how for emergency preparedness, they always say have wheat, have all this stuff. But then if you're living a life where you need protein, you have all that. But then I saw the big loop, the rise, that the carbohydrate is there for emergency. So to keep you alive until the protein can be found.
Great way to look at it. Yeah, I love that. Do you ever watch like the survival shows where they drop people out in the middle of nowhere? They're always looking for like the fish they can catch or the animal they can catch, because that's going to give them the fats and the proteins that they need that are essential. If they're looking around for plant foods, they're going to go pretty hungry. So yeah, think of it as like a fallback food. In an emergency, you can live on wheat. We did food storage ourselves growing up, and I remember we would have buckets of the wheat berries. And it was only much later in my life when I learned how to make like sourdough bread that I realized like I don't even think we had like a wheat grinder. Nobody knew how to make bread from scratch. Like my Mormon mom, I don't even think like knew how to make bread from scratch. So I think back, I'm like, we would have had wheat berries in buckets, but we would have died really quick because we didn't know what to do with them. I would have survived as long as we could on those instant potatoes.
Like I have a can opener.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, you've got plenty of food here. You just can't access it. And yeah, when insulin is activated, mainly through carbohydrates, that activation, you want to think of it almost like a light switch. It's going to stay on for several hours, 3, 4, 5 hours. And that's when you consume any carbohydrates. If it's carbohydrates on their own or a mix of carbohydrates, the fat storing hormone will be elevated for a certain amount of time. So if you can be choosy about when you consume your carbohydrates or how infrequently you consume your carbohydrates, that will limit the amount that insulin is high and thus storing energy, and can maximize the time that insulin is low and your body is doing the opposite, where it's like, okay, well, we stored this up, let's get it out, let's get this out of here. When you consume less carbohydrates, that's how your body shifts. So that's carbohydrates in a nutshell. Recommendations, I think for most people, where I've gotten to, as far as what I've kind of found to be helpful for people, I try to get somebody to about as low of a carbohydrate amount as somebody can tolerate. For many, many reasons. The availability thing, I think, is the biggest part, where we've got so many of them available all the time. If you can keep them at a low level, being very strict if you've got a condition where that's necessary. I know some people who can't have any carbohydrates, or they get symptoms of bipolar, like my friend Robin we talked about on episode 1. I know people that reverse type 2 diabetes, and their tolerance is just like really, really low. It's like it becomes a poison at some point to that person. And the more you can get it out, the more you can see that you can do much better with that. There's an ongoing trial by a company called Virta that is putting people on that are type 2 diabetic, that's putting them on low carbohydrate diets. They are reversing type 2 diabetes in like 50% of their cases. And it's almost like it's either like 85 or 90% of people are reducing medications when they just keep that very, very low. Some people can tolerate more than others. And like I said earlier, you may need to be thoughtful about how you prepare your carbohydrates. But that's how I'd be thinking about that. I would try to keep them basically as low as somebody could tolerate. If you're very active, you can have more. Performing, you can have more. Again, it's just a very low kind of storage availability that you really use when your body's heart rate is activated, you're under some type of stress. It's kind of sprinting type energy. So the last macronutrient we're going to go over is fat. I love the quote from Jerry Seinfeld, if you remember any of his stand-up, when everybody in the 90s is obsessed with fat, and there's fat content. What's the fat content? There's fat in it. It's going to be a me. We are going to deep dive into this at a later date, so we're not going to get too far into the woods here. Mm-hmm.
Who's Jerry Seinfeld?
Come on.
Because you're old.
Come on. Those are still so good, by the way. Those Seinfeld episodes, they hold up. They are still hilarious. I will fight anybody about that. Okay, fats. Fat comes in different types. Like I said, we're going to deep dive to this in much greater detail in the future. But we have fats that we call saturated fats, and we have fats that we call non-saturated fats. Basically, fats are chains that are kind of strung together, and they have bonds that hold the chemicals together. If a fat is said to be saturated, it means that all of the bonds connecting the chains of energy in the fat are saturated. So a saturated fat is going to be pretty much solid at room temperature. So examples of saturated fat would be butter, lard, and coconut. This is not obviously all of the saturated fats, and all fats are some saturated and some non-saturated, but that's just to give you an idea. The butter is primarily a saturated fat. Same with lard, same with coconut oil. This is what grandma used to cook with, because, and it used to be kept out at room temperature, usually just in a jar, because these saturated fats are extremely stable. So things that break down fats are going to be things like light, heat, and air. When fats are exposed to light, heat, and air, they can start to degrade, and they can start to oxidize. Oxidation is basically aging. It's when we are exposed to oxygen. It's what happens with rust. It's what happens, again, as we age. It's why we thought like free radicals were so bad and we needed to eat foods high in antioxidants. That's exactly where that idea came from. So again, the saturated fats are going to be the most stable fats. Non-saturated fats are going to include mono unsaturated and polyunsaturated. Mono means that one of the bonds in this chain is a double bond, which means a double bond can disconnect basically and bond with other things, including oxygen. That's where the oxidation comes from. And then we have polyunsaturated fats, and these include things like omega-3s, omega-6s, which we know are essential for the diet. So fat is another essential nutrient. You have to consume fat or you will die. They also include things like vegetable oils. So the subset of what we call vegetable oils would be things like sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil is a really big one in the United States. Canola oil is one, corn oil, cottonseed oil. Those are vegetable oils. There's a few other examples. But those all do different things in the body. We need fats to survive, like we said. Fats are used for many, many different things inside the body. So not only are they an energy source, they are an energy, but they also help build your hormones. They are literal like cushion for different things we need. This is our long-term storage, so we can have long-term energy to do things at a very low level for a really long time. If I'm talking about comparing carbohydrates and fats, I'll use an example where we talk about like a fire, where using a fire for, if you were to build a fire with carbohydrates, it's like building a fire with kindling, where it would flame up really, really quick. You'd have to continually like feed this fire. It would be really smoky, where if fat is a lot more like a log on the fire. And a log on the fire burns low and slow for a really, really, really long time. Like I said, we're going to deep dive into this in a future episode about why we had the thought that saturated fat in particular was really bad for us, and that we needed to shift our consumption from largely saturated fats over primarily to vegetable oils. Vegetable oils, I want you to really take this in. Next time you're at the store, go to where they sell vegetable oils and walk back and forth and see bottle after bottle after bottle after bottle after bottle of all of these vegetable oils. Not one single drop comes from a vegetable. How they were able to name vegetable oil as vegetable oil is, in my mind, one of the greatest scams we've ever had in the world of nutrition. No vegetable oils come from vegetables. I forgot to tag this. I'll put it on the website if you ever want to see it. You can always just Google how it's made canola oil. It goes step by step by step by step on how canola oil is made in a factory by using seeds, and it is heated to super high temperatures. It is deodorized. It is bleached. It goes through all kinds of crazy chemical processes that you can never do in your own kitchen. These oils are completely toxic. Please, if you take nothing else from what we're talking about as far as fat goes, by and large, anything that you're going to find on this list of the healthy fats. So what we have here is nuts and seeds in their pure form. It's not oil. So you're going to see almonds, pecans, walnuts, hazelnuts, Brazil nuts, cashews. Again, like we talked about before, those do have plant compounds that can be problematic for some people. Also with nuts and seeds, they also come with a pretty high amount of carbohydrates as well. So you don't just get the fats with nuts and seeds. This is going to give you a list of some good oils that you can be using. So unprocessed or extra virgin olive oil. I don't really love where it says butter from nuts and seeds. I'd say just eat normal butter. Extra virgin olive oil or coconut oil, I think both are not too problematic. Same with avocado oil. The trick with olive oil is so many olive oils are cut with seed oils because they're cheaper. So very difficult to find actually true pure olive oil these days, unfortunately. Other types of fats they list are coconut milk, fine. Fish oil, I debate whether that's actually pretty helpful or not. And then different kinds of fruits that have fat, which would be things like avocado, I think are fine. And then again, whole foods like butter. As far as recommendations for the amount of fat, is really, really difficult to recommend a specific amount. Fat does not make you fat. Fat, again, is a very essential nutrient that we need. Excessive carbohydrate intake and the consumption of seed oils are much greater kind of suspects when it comes to what is making us not feel well. Natural fats have been in our diet forever. I don't necessarily recommend a specific amount, but I will say that every time you get protein in nature, you get it with fat. They come together, especially when you're consuming animal products. You don't see that with plants. And yeah, the fats and the proteins always come together in a way that we can easily digest them. And so again, where I'm not giving people an exact recommendation for fat intake, just have enough fat that you feel like you've got good energy. You're not hungry all the time. Fat is very satiating, especially when it comes to protein. So eat, don't fear the fat. Don't cut the fat off your steak. It is good and part of what we need. And in our next episode, we'll go into a greater deep dive on, again, the idea of why we think saturated fat is so bad for us, and deep dive into whether that is actually the case or not. So that kind of wraps up our discussion. Do you guys have any questions? When we go to the very end of all of this, putting it all together, what the heck do we eat? What the heck do I eat? Largely, we can all agree that things that we need to eliminate or reduce are things that come in the middle of a grocery store, boxes, bags, cans, and stuff that's filled with those unhealthy oils, filled with sugar, filled with grains. Very problematic for a lot of people. If you're at the very least, eating foods like the one in this picture, save the spinach. I would not consume spinach. If you're eating mostly whole foods, you'll be fine. But again, the purpose of this was to understand what each of these individual foods do so that you can choose, okay, do I want more of this? Do I want less of this? Do I have enough of this? You can customize and individualize based on your own needs and desires.
Even just going to the grocery store, and we've been brainwashed or told off and on, we've got to have all this. And when I go to the store and you just see row after row of all the things that are bad,
yeah,
cereal and bread and all this stuff, but we don't focus enough on what we can.
Yep.
It's always what you can. And then we get discouraged and we want to quit.
Totally. That's such a good point. Exactly. No,
we were told to eat those.
They're heart healthy. It has the label right on the box. Heart healthy.
Oreo. Whatever.
Well,
Cheerios.
We'll get into all of that for sure. But yeah, you're right. Like I remember talking to one of my clients, and she was so frustrated that she couldn't lose weight, and she's going over like all these things that she can't have. And I'm like, it's not that you can't have them. It's just I don't care what you eat, but when you're saying you want this result, you want to lose fat, here's the foods that are going to help you do that. And here's these other foods that are not going to help you do that. And the problem is the ones that don't help you do that are delicious and incredible and amazing. And I'll never forget. She just said, like, this isn't fair. This is not fair that I can't eat all of these great foods that everybody else seems to eat, and I can't eat them. This isn't fair. Like, it makes me just want to give up. And it's so hard because, yes, like, you live in a world where we have donuts. We never had donuts evolving. It's like the best food that we could have created. It's calorie dense, has carbs and fat, and pizza and burritos and like all these amazing foods that taste wonderful, and they're just not great for us. And so it is discouraging. We feel like it's not fair that we have to live in a certain way to be healthy. But if we change the mindset and approach it the way you said, and just say, like, yeah, maybe I don't do well with cold cereal and Frosted Flakes, but maybe I can replace that with some eggs or something else that fits more of what's going to get me to my goals. And then you eat that in a way that you don't really restrict yourself. Like we said with those meal plans we gave out, like, you don't have to restrict yourself or think that you're over consuming. Eat until you're really full. That's what we want. That changes the mindset and hopefully is a little bit easier for people to stick with. So really glad you brought that up. And then all the resources are down there. There's a few articles. There's a few, again, episodes that I've done in the past. So feel free to use those. But those are the macronutrients.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.